Welcome to the Real Chili Podcast.
And the Golden Eagles of Marquette University in Milwaukee are bound for the Final Four for only the third time ever.
5 seconds left. Marquette down by one, trying to avoid the upset. Blue the drive, the left hand. It's good. 1 second to play. Vander Blue has put Marquette in front by one.
And I want to win every day as basketball players, as students, and I want to win every day, most importantly, as people.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Real Chili Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lavender. I'm joined today by my good buddy, Pete Mohan. And Pete, we've got a special guest on the show today. Marquette's biggest game in the non-conference so far is coming up next Wednesday against the Indiana Hoosiers in Bloomington, Indiana. It's going to be a great early season test for this Marquette team, which we're excited to see against higher level competition. And so without any further delay, I want to welcome Andy Bottoms onto the show. Andy is one of the showrunners of assemblycall.com and also writes for Inside the Hall, both of which cover Indiana Hoosiers basketball. Andy, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks guys for having me.
So this is the third game of the season for Marquette. I think it's the third game of the season for Indiana. It's clearly for both programs who are still trying to figure out a lot of new pieces fit together. This is going to be a great litmus test. But before we dive into all that, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about where Indiana basketball is this year. Obviously, it's the second year of head coach Archie Miller. You guys are coming off a 16-15 season from last year and still trying to figure out some pieces. But I'm wondering if you could give Marquette fans a little bit of a sense of just where this program is, where the fans think it is, where Archie Miller thinks it is, heading into this game next week against Marquette.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time, really, for IU fans. This will be our 8th year that we've been doing the Assembly Call postgame show, and we were talking before the season. You know, we do shows in the off season as well, and it's the most listeners, viewers, all those kinds of things that we've had really since we started. And the first year that we started was really when things started to turn the corner in the Crean era, when IU beat Kentucky on the shot by Christian Watford. You know, it included the season where they were ranked preseason number 1, but I would argue that fan interest and excitement is as high, if not higher, than even that season when they were ranked preseason number 1. And I think there's a few reasons for that. You know, one, Archie Miller, they made strides where he wanted to make strides last year. They took better care of the basketball. They got significantly better defensively than what fans had come to see in the last few years with Tom Crean. And then on the recruiting trail, he's also talked a lot about recruiting the state of Indiana better. He got Romeo Langford, who's the real headliner of the incoming class this year, but a number of other Indiana kids, some of whom I'm sure we'll talk about as we get into this, and is in good position with a number of guys in future classes. So, pretty much everything fans have heard from him, he's delivered on at this point. And so they're excited for the season. There are a lot of new pieces, but it's also a chance for him to have gotten more of, I guess, his, quote unquote, his guys in the door. Even the only freshmen that were there last year were guys that Crean had recruited and he kept in the mix. So it's a versatile roster. They're really deep compared to what they were a year ago. And even with some injuries they've had in the preseason this year, they've still, that depth has really been evident in the exhibition game they had and in the 2 regular season games as well. So fan interest is high. And much like you said in the intro, this is really the first test for IU. So, as we've looked forward to kind of mapping out what the season looks like, this was definitely the first one that says, all right, how good can this team really be? The first, answer to that question will probably be shaped by how they play on Wednesday night.
In some of our recent podcasts, we've talked a lot about expectations for Marquette this season, and we're in the 5th year of the Steve Wojciechowski era, and this is a roster for Marquette which has length at almost every position, which has size at almost every position, which for Marquette is not the norm. And so Marquette fans have high expectations of this definitely being a tournament team and hopefully being a team that can advance relatively far into the tournament. So flipping the script for IU, what would be a good season for IU? Where are the expectations of what this season needs to look like, come April?
Yeah, I think minimum expectation at this point is getting back to the NCAA tournament. Having missed the last couple seasons, I think that's definitely one. And last year, I think people in the excitement of Archie Miller, and I know we did this for the assembly call, we kind of allowed ourselves in the excitement to kind of talk ourselves into the idealized version of every player on the roster and think that somehow all of those great things would happen at the same time. And that did not happen. They did show good improvement, but when, push came to shove, there was still a long way to go. And so this year, I think that feeling is gone a little bit. And I think minimum expectations, as we've kind of framed it out, would be getting back to the NCAA tournament. I think top 4-ish finish in the Big Ten. With the unbalanced schedule in the Big Ten, unlike what you guys have in the Big East, it's a little bit harder to gauge, who truly the top 4 teams may be given what the schedule is. But IU's is relatively favorable, or at least middle of the road. So I think that's what most fans are expecting. Whether that's realistic or not, we'll start to find out this week. But I'd say that's what I'd put it at right now.
It seems like if a Marquette fan were to go to Indiana's ESPN page, for example, and unfortunately they show your previous 5 games and last season ended with a loss to Rutgers. Now, that's not the best way to end a season, unfortunately. I'm sorry I had to bring that up.
But I'm taking a vow never to speak of that game again. So.
But with the infusion of Langford and transfer Evan Fitzner from St. Mary's, what additional dynamic does that bring on top of the guys that are coming back from last year? And what progress do you see from the other guys on the roster?
I think with Romeo, it's really a scorer. He hasn't shot the ball from the outside or from the free throw line particularly well this year. I think that will get better over time, but I would categorize him as much as a scorer than maybe I would as a shooter. But really last year it was really Juwan Morgan inside, and they were hoping that they could get, good games out of Robert Johnson in the backcourt, but there just wasn't a lot of firepower in the backcourt and a lot of guys being put into positions that really out of necessity may not have been their best fit. Fitzner is more of a shooter than a scorer, I guess I should say. So he's a 6'10" guy who can really space the floor, was a 40% three-point shooter coming in from St. Mary's, and nothing that we've seen from him thus far this season suggests anything other than that. Has scored a little bit more in the post, I think, than people thought, but has been a pretty steady contributor coming off the bench. So he's another guy who, floor spacer, things like that. So I think both of those guys in some ways serve the same purpose in terms of opening up things inside for Juwan Morgan and just opening up driving lanes where last year IU shot the ball incredibly poorly from the three-point range, and defenses would basically just pack it in and dare IU to make shots. And more often than not, that is not how things shook out. So I think both those guys really serve a similar function. And then the other guy I'd throw into the newcomer mix is Rob Phinisee. He has started at point guard in all 3 games so far. I'm including that exhibition game. Part of that initially was due to an injury to Devontae Green, who was kind of the incumbent starter, it seemed like, coming in. But Phinisee started the Southern Indiana game, had 13 points in that, 4 assists, and has continued to play really well and has continued to start. So that's one of the big things with the fan base is who the point guard should be. They're pretty much polar opposites in terms of the way they play the position. So it's been an interesting debate. But I think those 3 guys to this point have been the newcomers who have gotten the most minutes and are poised to make the biggest impact over the course of the season.
Is Devontae Green, is he cleared back from his injury, or is that something still lingering that is keeping Phinisee on the court?
No, he's played the last 2 games. He actually had 15 points. He led the team in scoring in the Chicago State game, albeit somewhat inefficiently just in terms of if you look at some of his shooting numbers. So he's back, and he played in the Montana State game on Friday night as well. I think it's a little bit of if a guy's playing well, leave him in there. But I also think, the way those 2 guys play, I'd say Phinisee is more of the what you'd envision as a consummate point guard, steady hand, nothing super flashy, but just a steady guy who gets guys in the right position, has played pretty good defense so far, although certainly the Marquette game will be a new level of challenge on that end of the floor. And Devontae is and has been, over his Indiana career, a guy who has been really up and down, can make some really flashy plays. Sometimes that flash is unnecessary, as some would say. I think there's a little bit of, like I said, they're very different players at the position. They've actually played together a little bit in some of these, as the margins gotten higher in these games. And, we've started to wonder on the post-game show if Devontae might not be better fit to play a little bit more 2-guard than he is the point, and maybe spell Phinisee at the point. So I think Phinisee will be, there were some people who thought he might be the guy by the end of the season. It seems like potentially the injury has accelerated that, although we really don't know if he would have started before, regardless of Green's injury. But both will play on Wednesday night and have played in the 2 games that matter.
Just for the fans out there that aren't aware, I don't think we've said this explicitly, but Indiana's best player is a McDonald's All-American freshman, Romeo Langford. He's a 6'6" scorer. When we're talking about him, recognize that he's coming in as one of the top players in the country. With that said, maybe you could give us a little bit of the hallmarks of Archie Miller's coaching style, and then how does having Langford in this offense change that? Does Miller go and change his offensive philosophy to accommodate Langford's skill set? How do you see that evolving this season?
It's interesting because Miller had said heading into the season that the team was further ahead defensively than offensively. And there is very little that I've seen thus far that would suggest that's not true. They've played extremely well defensively. And so that's really, from an Archie Miller standpoint, kind of what he's been known for. And I think one of the reasons that IU fans were so excited to get him as the coach, because, the defense had been so poor for a few years prior. And so they've really scored a lot of points off of turnovers in every game. They forced at least 19 turnovers in each of the 3 games, scored at least 25 points off of turnovers in each of the 3 games. And so they've been successful that way. And I think that's been able to augment an offense that has, still kind of figuring out its way with the new pieces that are there. They do really try to attack the basket. The team, while they're probably going to be better as a 3-point shooting team, have still not been great in that regard. And I think the stats would bear that out. He's talked about attacking the basket consistently. And Romeo's a guy who can do that. One stretch in the Chicago State game, I think scored 10 or 11 points in a row, just attacking the basket. So I think that's what you'll see from IU. Juwan Morgan is a really good player inside as well, had a tremendous season last year. And so this team is going to try to play through the paint as much as they can and really try to hammer it inside and maybe get some kickouts for threes. But 3-point shooting, I think he said in the post game the other night, that's not this team's niche. And I would definitely agree with that. And like I said, the numbers kind of bear that out. They got hot in the second half of the exhibition game and shot really well, but really in the 2 regular season games, they haven't shot it particularly well. So it's more off the dribble, trying to attack the basket. They've run some nice. You're starting to see a few more like 2-man type things with Juwan and Romeo, who both are going to attract a lot of defensive attention. They're going to try to get a lot of points in the paint, and they've been successful doing that thus far against inferior competition. And if IU starts shooting a lot of 3-pointers in the game, it probably is a good sign for Marquette, I would say.
Let's transition maybe to a little bit more conversation, getting into the specifics of this Marquette-Indiana matchup. And I think it's so interesting to hear the extent to which you think IU is going to want to play through the post and move the ball through Juwan, who's clearly one of their top players. One of the developments that we've seen in Marquette, granted over the past 2 games, that has Marquette fans so excited is that they're starting to put together some defensive identity, something that's been absent the past several years. Interior defense led by Theo John, and just in general more length and height, which has enabled Marquette to play some pretty stout defense inside. So I think that interior game is going to be really interesting to see how Marquette, Theo John, Joey Hauser, Brendan Bailey, how Marquette can defend Juwan Morgan. Can they defend him without fouling? How they play that interior game and see if they can let Indiana get theirs from inside. So I'm wondering, Andy, how you see that shaking out and if you think that's kind of one of the key bellwethers in this game.
I definitely do, just because, IU has some shooters, some guys that could get hot from the outside. But, I mean, if you look at their shooting splits right now, through 2 games, they're 69% on 2s and 31% on 3s. And so one potential issue with that is IU likes to attack the basket and wants to get fouled. They have also shot incredibly poorly from the free throw line. It's like, it's great to see guys getting fouled with regularity, and then you look up and you're shooting 56% from the free throw line, and it really doesn't make you feel a great level of confidence there. But that's not going to change what IU does. It's been a few guys that have really struggled. Romeo is one of them, and he's a guy that's going to get fouled a lot. So that's a potential concern. But in talking to some people, that's not kind of how he shot free throws as in high school. So should seem that there'd hopefully be some regression there to more what they can expect from him. But I do think that's going to be a key matchup, because I don't think Archie Miller is going to be happy if IU comes out and starts taking a bunch of threes. So Morgan is a guy that, went through the NBA draft process, gave him some feedback about, being able to step out a little bit more consistently and make shots. But when they've really been at their best this season, they've been adamant about getting him the ball in the post. They did that at the beginning of both halves of the Montana State game and scored, I think the first half, maybe their first 14 or 16 points in the paint. And I think the first few minutes of the second half, the first 5 shots that they made were all layups or dunks, really trying to pound the ball inside. So they're definitely going to do that. I think they'll look to test those younger guys, as you mentioned, and see what they can do. Juwan has had an interesting 4-year career, really played through some injuries early on, broke out last year, and has been a little bit up and down. But I think this year, the Montana State game really tried to assert himself. And I think in a big game, it'll be an area where they really look to give him the ball inside and then try to have Fitzner somewhere when he's on the floor close that he can kick it out to and get some open threes, more so off of getting the ball inside to him and playing inside out as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, I think it's actually been really fascinating, the growth of Marquette's defense, in that I can never remember them having this, or at least the appearance of this stout of an interior defense. And even the stats back us up. I mean, granted, we've played 2 cupcakes, but a 19 block percentage, which is good for 31st in the country. I don't think I've ever seen our defense do something like that. And a 2-point, we're 4th right now in the country in 2-point percentage allowed. So those are things that are, I'm sure, shocking to most Marquette fans at this point. But really, it's a testament to the development of Theo John, I think, on the defensive end. I think that there will be probably some opportunity for Indiana to hit some threes. I know that, we've done a little bit better job, that being Marquette, at guarding the 3-point line in these first couple games than we did last season, but still there are some issues. Marcus Howard, he's not the tallest guy, so people have been able to shoot over him in the past, and Sam Hauser, who also gets a lot of minutes, not the most fleet of foot, so he's at times had trouble guarding out to the 3-point line. But as I mentioned, Theo John has shown some incredible flashes of his ability to hedge on the perimeter, and I think that's one of the keys to slowing down Langford, is if Theo John can stay on the court without fouling and really continue that impressive hedging game on the perimeter and slowing down Langford's downhill approach to getting into this defense, I think that could be the deciding factor.
And, so Pete, you mentioned it in there. In addition to Theo, I think one of the other keys here is, Marcus Howard, who is our, all-world, certainly one of the top, guards in the country, at least in terms of scoring. He's listed at 5'11". Sometimes he has his hair grown out a little bit more, so that could add to that. He's a diminutive guy, plays with his heart on his sleeve, can be good defensively in situations, but if you're Indiana, that's one of the most obvious spots you're going to attack. I mean, that's where everybody is going to look to attack. But Andy, I kind of want to flip that around. If you're Marquette and you're looking at the Indiana roster, where are you going to look to attack this Indiana roster?
I think the first place that will get tested is the point guard spot, and that's why I think that the Howard and I guess likely Rob Finney at this point matchup becomes a really interesting one for IU defensively. Finney has been really good defensively. Archie Miller's talked about how well he's played on that end of the floor, but again, it's a totally different level of test there. But if I was attacking them, I'd really force one of those guys. How good can they guard you? That's one. The other would be, and it's a little bit more personnel dependent, but IU did struggle with ball screen defenses at times last year, and it really depended who the post player was. So Deron Davis is one of the big guys that IU has. He's a little bit further ahead than certainly I expected. I think a lot of other people expected, coming back off an Achilles injury from last year. So he's been playing, somewhat sparingly, maybe 10, 12 minutes a game. But a more traditional back to the basket post guy who presents some challenges for other defenses when he's on the floor, but he also is not the most laterally quick guy out there. So, he gets, they see him out there. I think he's a guy they would look to attack in ball screen situations and try to force to get the defense into rotation. Those are kind of the two individual players. IU has gotten a lot more size and length on defense this year. I think that's contributed a lot to how they've done. But last year they did not defend the 3-point shot very well, particularly early in the season. And knowing that's one of Marquette's strengths is another thing that may keep IU fans up at night. So I think ball movement for Marquette becomes pretty important at that point. And if they can get IU in some defensive rotation situations, can they get out to shooters in time and things like that? Again, for a team that shoots the 3 so well, I don't think I think Marquette's going to do that regardless, and take some shots. But I do think that's another area where, they can look back and see that that's an area that IU's been vulnerable at times last year, less so this year. The pack line that Archie Miller plays, everybody's really trying to, prevent dribble penetration, prevent guys getting into the lane, and then closing out from there. So if you get them in rotation, there's a chance to get some open threes.
One of the things that in this game that maybe is a little more ephemeral, I think, is the level of experience that each roster has. We've talked about the minutes that freshmen are getting at Indiana. Marquette, while we don't have quite as many freshmen, there are still a lot of new faces in the form of transfers. And so it's going to be really interesting to see. Neither of these teams, while there is experience at certain positions, someone like Sam Hauser and Marcus Howard comes to mind for Marquette, and Juwan Morgan for Indiana, while there's experience, a lot of the key pieces for both teams are very inexperienced. And to put these kids in a relatively high-pressure situation early in the season, it's going to be interesting to see how these kids react, because, you have a Romeo Langford who's clearly a talented individual, but hasn't been, played this level of competition in college yet, and the same for a lot of Marquette's kids. So that's going to be, in addition to some of the specific individual player matchups, I want to see which new faces kind of show up, and when the lights get a bit brighter, it's always fun to see who shines.
Yeah, I think from IU's perspective, it'll be the first time that these guys, while I'm sure they saw it on recruiting visits and things like that, it'll be their first time playing in front of what should be a packed and raucous crowd at Assembly Hall.
Right.
The crowds for the first couple of games have been okay, but they're 40-point blowouts that are pretty hard to get too excited about. And so I think from a fan perspective, everybody's knows what a big game this is and will be excited about it. So I think that becomes pretty big for both teams. Can IU's guys not get too amped up by being in front of that? And for Marquette, as you said, the first kind of opportunity to be in that kind of situation, how do they react? But you're right. IU has a lot of freshmen playing minutes. Justin Smith is a sophomore. He's playing pretty significantly. So really the guys for IU that are playing substantial minutes that are upperclassmen are really just Juwan Morgan, Devontae Green's a junior, Deron Davis, that I talked about before, is a junior, but he hasn't played a ton of minutes. And then Zach McRoberts and Evan Fitzner. A lot of the guys that you'd think would be prominently featured in the box score when this thing's all said and done are going to be guys who are freshmen and sophomores, I think, on both sides of it. So that will that could tip the scales one way or another for sure.
Yeah, one thing I'm looking forward to is Marquette's own 5-star Joey Hauser, and he's looked pretty good so far. He looks like a great all-around player. He hasn't really shined in any one particular way yet, but the fact that he has a high basketball IQ certainly shows. And I don't know, he's kind of like Wisconsin's Jimmy Chitwood. And I'm really looking forward to him playing at Assembly Hall because I feel like he'll look natural out on that court. I think that this could be a breakout game for Joey. He hasn't really caught fire at all on the offensive end. He's had a few threes that would have been big momentum builders in some of these games rattle out and things like that. So look out for him to get things going. And you kind of mentioned the inability to sometimes cover the low post. I think that's an interesting dynamic from Marquette because we are predicated on the three-point shot for the most part. There's guys that have shown an improved post game. I mean, Theo John has been good in these first two games, but the Hauser brothers really are pretty nifty in the mid post. And if they get caught with a mismatch, I think that could be a tipping point in this game, whether they're able to score and get fouled in those situations, and more importantly, whether they can find guys out of that post position when they're doubled. So I'm looking forward to seeing how they pass out of the post. Has Indiana shown the ability to, make plays in those situations? Have they shown strength in doubling and making turnovers?
They haven't doubled a lot, I think, in large part because they haven't really needed to. Nobody they've played has really been any kind of inside presence. They did a little bit of that last year, but I think some of that was out of necessity. They were really undersized. By the end of the season last year, they really weren't playing anybody over 6'7". And so it was a little bit of out of necessity in those situations. So they have been very good at forcing turnovers this year. That has been pretty much a constant in any of the games they've played. So they've, on average, in the low 20s turnovers between the exhibition game and the other two. So forced 25 against Montana State on Friday. And so that's been a big part of their offense, is being able to, get guys out in transition off of turnovers and things like that. So that has been defensively what they've probably done the best this year, but it hasn't been the result of doubling in those kinds of scenarios.
With just a few minutes left here, I kind of want to get to predictions and what we each think the game's going to look like. So this is an 8:30 p.m. Eastern tip between Marquette and Indiana and Bloomington, Indiana. It's on FS1 for Big East fans. It's the second of a doubleheader, a nice little doubleheader. The first being Villanova in Michigan.
Well, I want to ask real quick about this, Mike. Since we're talking about these matchups, Andy, what do Big Ten fans think about the Gavitt games? I know it takes probably second seat to the Big Ten ACC Challenge, which has been a stalwart in college basketball for so long, but it really produces some interesting matchups. What do you guys think?
Yeah, IU's been in it. I think played Creighton a couple years ago. Last year, I think it was Seton Hall. So it's a good chance to get some solid matchups. I think if anybody had a complaint about it, it would be that it becomes as the Big Ten's going to a 20-game schedule this year. You're getting games more like locked into events like this. You've got the Big Ten ACC. Now the Gavitt games is a little bit more rotational because there's too many teams. There's not, everybody doesn't have to play in it every year. Mm-hmm. I think if there's any complaint, it's that it somewhat limits teams' ability to go out and schedule maybe another more marquee game or things like that, because they know they have this one and they got so many home games they need to schedule and buy games and all that stuff. So I don't know if that's a fair complaint or not, because I tend to think that, the top end teams, when they match them up from each league, can have some really good matchups. So I don't think anybody has a real complaint about it. I think the Big Ten schedule kind of infringing upon more of the schedule as a whole, and they've started playing 2 Big Ten games in early December. So the Big Ten schedule makes it a little bit hard to do some of the other things that some teams might want to do in the non-conference. But I think it's been, positive experiences, at least from an IU perspective, in the 3 games this will be the third that I can really remember. That's been some, chances of good competition to go play a road game in a tough environment last year, and against an experienced Seton Hall team was a good early test for IU. They didn't play particularly well in that game, but it was, I think so. And as a college basketball fan, I like that it forces some of these teams to maybe play a tougher opponent or in an environment that they might not normally play of their own volition. So that part of me really likes it. It's just, I think that the complaints would largely be around just the scheduling of it in general.
Well, I'll let you jump back in, Mike, but I just think that this matchup, when we look back in March, people are going to be like, wow, that was a matchup between 2 pretty damn good teams. I wish I would have paid more attention to that game. It's not going to get the highlights of the Villanova-Michigan matchup, of course.
So looking ahead to this matchup, Ken Pom has this as a 77-73 victory for Indiana. I'll be interested to see what Vegas thinks, but I'm sure Vegas, just this being a home game for Indiana, will probably give them a slight nod. Andy, I want to toss it over to you. If you're in the position to make a prediction, we'd love to hear what you think or how you think this game is going to turn out.
So I think one thing that kind of alluded a little bit to injuries that IU's had in the non-conference in the preseason. Zach McRoberts, who I mentioned before, he didn't play very much against Montana. Sat out the whole second half with a back injury. He's a guy, you look at the stat sheet, you look at the averages. He's not a guy who scores a ton of points, but does all the little things and is IU's best defender. If he can't play, I think that has maybe more of a bearing on the outcome than people might think. He's another guy, to your point about the Housers, that he looks like he's an extra or maybe a starring character in Hoosiers. So he's right out of that mold, Indiana kid that everybody's really taken to there. So I think that becomes a big one. I'm going to assume that he does play, and so I like IU's chances here. I think the home court is a big factor here. I think if the game was at Marquette, you could probably twist my arm to say that Marquette would maybe eke out a victory, just because of IU's youth and playing in a road environment would be very difficult for them. But I think the fact that this is at home, I've been really impressed with how IU's played defensively. And I think, it's a case with Marcus Howard where he's going to get his no matter what. Although I would like to see him shoot more like he did in your first game than the second. And looking at the box score, so maybe that version of him shows up in Bloomington. But if you can start to limit some of the other options that Marquette has outside of Howard, then you kind of take your chances. But I've been impressed with what IU's done defensively. If they can continue to force turnovers and get some easy baskets that way, I think it helps an offense that is still growing into itself. But I like Juwan Morgan, veteran in this position. So I'd give IU the slight nod. I think the Ken Pom projection of a 4-6, maybe that kind of score range game, I think will be there. I don't think either team in any event is going to kind of run away from the other. It's a good evenly matched game, and one that will be one of the better ones from my perspective in the November part of the regular season.
All right, folks, so that's going to do it for us here on the Real Chili podcast today. You can find material on the Marquette game from Andy Bottoms and some of his coworkers at assemblycall.com and also insidethehall.com. Andy, do you guys have anything on either of those platforms previewing or certainly post-game the Marquette matchup coming up?
So nothing up yet. On Monday afternoon, we will typically do, I won't be on it, but we do typically do an assembly call show where we'll, have a few people around. Mike DeCourcy from the Big Ten Network is always on for a little bit of that. I'm sure this game will come up, and then we just started that this year, but we'll look to do some previews there. So that will be there. And then Inside the Hall, that kind of coverage will probably be more in the, I would guess, Tuesday range as they look forward to it. But they always do kind of a what to expect piece there, which kind of gives IU fans ideally a similar perspective on Marquette as what I hopefully have given to your listeners, but just kind of give some ideas of who to watch for, things like that. So that I believe will be Tuesday or Wednesday morning that would be up leading up to the game.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining the show. I think this is going to be a fun matchup to watch. I will actually be there in person, so very excited to see how this one shakes out. But thanks again for joining the show. Appreciate you taking the time, and good luck on Wednesday and for the rest of the season.
Hey, no problem. Glad to do it. Good luck to you guys as well. And I think you guys have looks like to be a really solid team, and should be able to do well in the Big East and get in the NCAA tournament as well. So best of luck the rest of the way. Just not on Wednesday.
Appreciate it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for us here on the Real Chili podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be coming to you immediately post-game, the Marquette-Indiana matchup. Until then, signing off, Mike Lavender, Pete Mohan, and for the rest of the fellows here on the Real Chili podcast, we'll talk to you next time.